Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 185, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/185. And today I am very happy to be joined by Ace Archist. Ace, I think a lot of my audience probably knows who you are, but do you just want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I am ace_archist on Twitter, and you can, if you're on Twitter, you might have seen me there arguing with people nonstop, incessantly for no particular reason, getting into very extremely long-winded Twitter arguments that no one should ever have to get into. And that's pretty much the basis of it. I'm so happy to be invited here. Thank you, Patrick.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And we met each other at Childerberg.
Yes, 3. That was very fun.
Yeah, it was awesome. And my only regret about Childerberg was just that there wasn't a whole lot of time to really individually get to know people.
Right.
Which isn't really a problem because you're just too busy having fun anyways.
Yeah, it's just a matter of fact. That was just going to happen at a big event like that. Yeah. Yeah,
no, it was a complete blast though. And
oh yeah,
it's awesome. So hopefully next year.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Yeah.
So today I wanted to bring you on and just talk a little bit about, because I know that you're philosophically inclined. And so I thought that we would talk about, there was this tweet that I saw that Stephen King made. And I'll throw it up on the screen here for when watching the video version. So he says here, let's keep it simple, you anti-vaxxers. You have a right to kill yourself, whether with booze, cigarettes, chew, or high living. You do not have the right to kill others by spreading a virus. That's not freedom, it's selfishness. And this is like the prevailing argument that I've heard from the left. It sounds similar to this argument, Ace, and I'm sure that you've heard this before, is, let's see, I don't think it's liberty if you don't have the means to like provide for your family. Like, what liberty does someone have if we don't have a welfare state to make sure that, they're provided for?
Right. Yeah. It's also very similar to kind of like the gun argument, how we can't allow people to buy guns because they could go out and shoot people with them. Right. So they would be like, well, your right to buy a gun doesn't supersede my right to live, they are separate things. But I'm sure we'll get into that, similar things like that. Throughout this discussion.
So have you heard anyone use this argument on Twitter that in your arguments at all?
Oh, I've definitely seen people use it for sure. Yeah. And if you just want the quick rundown of how I would address that, I would just say that, there's a difference between someone threatening you and just being a risk around you. Right. So someone can be just a risk. Like if you're interacting with other people, the chance or the risk that those people could hurt you goes up just by interacting with other people, going from a situation where you were alone by yourself to a situation where you're now with people. That risk alone does not necessarily mean that you are authorized by libertarian standards anyway to encroach upon someone else defensively, because it's not defensive if it's not an actual threat.
Yeah. And this kind of, so I did personal injury work earlier in my legal career, and there's a lot of like discussion in negligence theory, the theory of negligence, in law school. It's one of the first classes you have is torts. So you talk a lot about private wrongs and things like that. So this idea of, and there was a good article on my website talking about when does imposing risk become aggression, and this was. Sean Leal did this. He did this article talking a lot about, he used the example of someone driving drunk in a car. And people have used this before. Have you heard anyone on Twitter use this argument?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, this is, classic.
Well, okay. So how do they say it when you've heard it?
Well, they'll say, well, look, first off, they'll just use the license argument. Well, look, you have to be licensed to drive, and then they'll also equate that to like getting a vaccine card and stuff like that. But they'll also say that, well, if you're drunk driving, you're a threat to other people, and therefore you're legally obligated not to do that, or the police are legally obligated or justified to stop you. That'll be their argument generally.
And I think it's a good comparison on. They're not right in their arguments, but I think it's a good kind of allegory to bring up.
It is. It's a good analogy because we can kind of,
And okay, in the one argument that Sean brings up that I think is good is that, well, you can't pull someone over without objective evidence that they are driving drunk.
Yes. This is what I talk about all the time. In fact, this was usually my go-to argument when responding to these people is that, look, you can't just assume that everyone is infected with COVID. Like, you don't get to make that assumption. If you want, like, even if we grant you that if someone is infected with COVID, you get to, forcibly quarantine them. If we accept that, that still doesn't get you to where you want to go. You first have to prove, the burden of proof is on you to prove that they are actually infected with COVID and that they're a threat to you with COVID. So both those things have to be true before you can even talk about, defensively encroaching upon their boundaries to protect yourself.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because to give a little background too, the last few episodes have been talking about my local activism, and I don't know if I brought this up except on Twitter, is that there's a big hubbub in my county, which is a very rural county, about how the school board voted to stop quarantining close contacts of COVID positive individuals, because there were so many students that were out of class that they couldn't hold school.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't because of any logic or arguments or, we took a look at the science and decided, or it wasn't even because they started collecting data about those kids they had preemptively quarantined.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't exist.
Right.
So what they did is, oh, well, we can't have school because no one's coming because we've quarantined them all. So what we're going to do is stop that. Imagine that. And then so the county health department stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. We're going to force you to do this policy. And
yeah, it's unbelievable.
So anyways, I've been taking a look at the law in Wisconsin and how this works. And like, the health departments have scary power. And if you're thinking kind of like from a conspiratorial point of view, the medical martial law is the perfect way to gain huge government power.
100%. It's the best way, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like, it's an invisible threat, and therefore, it can play to people's fears, their imaginations, right? Because it's always the fear of the unknown that it scares people more than like the known threat that they can see.
Right. Yeah. And so, but going back to what you said, I think that's great. First, you have to prove that they have COVID, right? And you have to prove that they're a threat to you.
Yeah.
And it seems like, so the Wisconsin Health Department, the state health department, has an administrative code that governs it. And this administrative code, the DHS code, sets forth the elements that the health department is supposed to prove when they want to quarantine someone.
Mm-hmm.
And that rings to be some of those elements. I'm just pulling from memory here. But it's like, they have to if you refuse to be quarantined, they have to serve you with a warrant. You have the right to hire a lawyer. You have to show up, and they have to prove by clear and convincing evidence, which is a step below beyond a reasonable doubt, that that you're infected and that you pose a public health risk, basically. So,
yeah.
But so back to this drunk driving, this analogy. Yeah. Sorry for that aside there, but yeah. So he says, this comparison leads to the assertion that since the risk of dying in a pandemic is higher than that of drunk driving, and quote, we as a society have accepted the use of force against drunk drivers, specifically because of the additional risk they impose, and because it is other people's actions, not wearing a mask, not getting vaccinated, or refusing to show proof of it, are what generates the elevated risk to others, that it is justified to use force against those who could potentially infect others, just as we do drunk drivers. So let's see, he says a bunch of other things, but so what do you think? You said that we have to objectively prove those two elements.
Right. And I think to clear up the drunk driving thing, I think this is important to distinguish, in my view, from libertarian theory. Merely driving with alcohol in your blood is not an aggression. What would be an aggression is actually reckless and endangerment on the road. If you're like swerving a bunch of places, if you're driving recklessly like that. So, people might think we're splitting hairs here, but I think this is a fundamental distinction that needs to be made. It is, once you actually become a threat in the form of you're actually, causing harm or in the process of causing harm by your reckless driving, that's when action can be taken against you, not before. And also we have to prove that, so whether you have alcohol in your blood or not, what ultimately matters is if you are a threat on the road, and you could have that without alcohol in your blood. So I don't think the drunk driving analogy, even when we're being generous to them, really works in their favor.
Yeah, and that's the old Lou Rockwell
Yeah,
argument. Yeah.
right.
Um, yeah, and so kind of stemming from the Lou Rockwell argument, I guess that leads naturally into the Walter Block article
Yeah.
that we were discussing, because I think as a libertarian, in granted, so the article that I'm referring to is Walter Block's A Libertarian Analysis of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And I'll put that link in the show notes page here. But do you just want to, kind of naturally introduce and lead into this?
I can kind of give you, well, if you want to introduce and lead into it, I can give my opinions on it, or whichever way you want. It doesn't matter.
Sure, sure. Well, so basically, he goes through what everyone has said, and from a libertarian point of view.
Hmm.
And what I think he really tries to do in this paper is say that everyone who is commenting on the COVID-19 pandemic is they're kind of running afoul of the is-ought gap, because what they're saying is that libertarianism says this about viruses and the theory of, the philosophy of aggression and spreading viruses, but they're not really taking a look at the empirical evidence. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so for most of it, certainly. And I think he brought up a good point, at least in the beginning, where he was talking about like, it's true that, trying to make a utilitarian case one way or the other isn't really a libertarian point of view, even if it is valid, even if it would be valid from a utilitarian point of view. So I do agree with him there. I tend to disagree with him heavily as he goes on through the article, though.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things that he was at a disadvantage, and plainly points this out, is that this came out and he was writing most of it very early in the pandemic. So this was early 2020, and I think he started writing it in May, or he says kind of towards the bottom. So one thing that he kind of does that I don't agree with is he uses this analogy of having a gun that had a revolver that has 100 chambers, and 15 of those chambers have bullets in them.
Like Russian roulette, yeah.
Yeah, and so he compares someone walking around a town, and I don't want to mischaracterize or strawman him at all. So correct me if I'm going astray here. But he analogizes to someone running around town with this revolver, pointing and shooting it at people to be. And I think the comparison is that that's the just people walking around, because at this point vaccines weren't an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
So,
that's fair. That's what I got from it too. Yeah.
And where I part from his analogy is that, again, someone running around with a revolver pointing it at people is an objective outward indication that they are threatening aggression.
Right. It's not just because I think we said this before we started, but like my biggest problem with that analogy is I think he's conflating risk with threat. So with COVID, obviously with COVID, there's a heightened risk someone could catch COVID and die, right? I think that's just true and fair to say. But what's not implied by that is that it's not the same as a threat. Pointing a gun at someone and then running around, even if you don't have bullets, or even if the bullets are rubber, as he uses in his further down in his analogy, it's like that is a threat. I wouldn't even call that a risk. That's just a threat. It might have a risk associated with it, obviously, but that's an outward threat. That's rises above the level of just a mere risk between like probabilities, because like a risk is just like, okay, I'm going to assess the probability that something could happen to me, right? Like if you're driving on the road, there's a risk, you could say, given the data of like how many people crash on the road every year, you could say that, well, given if we factor all those inputs in, there's an output, which is a risk, which would say that my probability of crashing or dying in a car crash is this. But that's not the same thing as a threat, right? So he goes on to say that, well, it would be justified, essentially, in this case, to forcibly quarantine people because they're essentially a threat. But I would disagree with that, and I would just say, well, no, you can't just lock people up because they're risks, which is what I think what is more apt of an analogy. Like if someone walks into the room with a gun, right? Someone has a gun holstered. Yeah, and let's say in the room, no one else had a gun before. This one person walked in, he had one gun, and it's holstered. Your risk of being shot is now not zero, right? It's risen above a 0% chance, the risk. But that doesn't mean just because the risk has risen, that doesn't mean you therefore have a right to, grab the gun from him or forcibly hold him down or anything like that, because he's shown no outward explicit threat of actually using the gun for harm. So I think that would be my biggest disagreement with his analogy.
So another kind of analogy he uses is, or I guess a base question, because he published his entire email exchange with another
Yeah,
prominent libertarian. I've never seen that before in a formal paper.
it's great. Yeah.
So that's very Walter Block of him.
Yeah.
But the other thing that he, man, I lost my. Oh yeah, would you quarantine Typhoid Mary? Basically, and as I understand it, Typhoid Mary was okay. I don't know the story. I should have looked it up. Sorry, but as I understand it, it's a person who clearly had typhoid who was known to have gone to a public area and spread it to a bunch of people, and a few of those people died.
Right.
And
I think. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I was just. I mean, I would think that tuberculosis has an outward kind of like expression of illness.
Yeah.
And the lethality rate, and I think this argument wouldn't be lost on him, I don't think, but the mortality rate is much higher.
Right.
In my understanding. But
yeah. So I think how I would answer that is I would say, well, yes, I do think that if you actually are an outward threat to people, then you can like use defensive force to stop them within proportionality, right? To stop them. So if someone actually is like if someone was like, I don't know, radioactive or something, I do think it would be defensive to keep them away from other people. But I think we still have to go back to what we said before, which is that we first have to prove, one, that they have this disease, and two, that this disease is actually a very imminent threat. And also, it's very hard, just practically speaking, to prove that someone infected someone else. You know what I mean? Just practically. So we kind of have a knowledge problem here, where we're just not able to prove this in the first place. So it kind of, I think the anti-lockdown case for libertarianism, it looks very good if you apply all those three things consistently. But yeah, ultimately, yes, if someone is ultimately like radioactive like that, like they do have a serious disease, yeah, I do think you can like, defensively stop them from interacting with other people or infecting them. But as I said, there's a knowledge problem on like, how do you prove that this person infected this person? It's very hard to prove.
yeah, and the proportionality question is interesting too, because of course you can't really infringe on their rights. So like you can't imprison them within like 4 dimensions either. I think your duty is to make sure they don't come into contact with anyone else.
That's right. Yeah, you can't like box them in a cell or something like that. No.
Yeah. Oh, I love this, and I wish that this argument was purely theoretical, but it's so crazy that we're just living in a time where this is a really serious question.
Yeah, it's so, yeah. And we can even get into that even more. It's like if if they force like airplanes or airlines to shut down so no one can leave the country, it's like, in a sense, that's kind of like a big prison that everyone's being forced to lock in because the state has locked down all these avenues of getting out. So it's like, it's crazy how this is actually a thing, as you were saying.
It is crazy. And before I forget, I wanted to make sure everyone knew that article I was reading was Sean Leal on my website, and I'll put that in the show notes page. He publishes that on Liberty Weekly, and it's a good read. But yeah, it is. I mean, it really, especially in Australia.
God.
You have the ability to travel. Well, no, you don't. Sorry. It's literally an island. And I was going to say, theoretically, if they confine you to the island, you'd have the ability to travel around the island, but you don't even have that.
Right.
They have district zones too.
Yeah. Yeah, Australia is insane. And that's not to, devalue what's happening here in America or any other country, but Australia is on a completely another level of just insanity, of just complete totalitarian insanity. It's like, once you get to the point where, like that story where they were like shooting dogs or whatever, you saw that. So that their own, like the owners of people coming to see them who might have COVID, they don't want them to come there because they might possibly have COVID. Like, no, that's just like pure totalitarianism.
It's insane, and it's I see the police officers going along with it too. And
Shocking.
yeah, and I mean, and that's not to say that every single police officer is going
Hmm.
along with it. I'm sure there's some who have resigned.
Yeah.
But large scale, and not even male police officers. You would think, I don't know, this is completely anecdotal, but I would think that male police officers would be more likely to go along with it than female police officers because they're by nature generally, I'm generalizing, but females are more empathetic naturally,
Hmm.
I think. They're kind
Sure.
of nurturing just by their biological nature.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it's crazy, man. It's crazy, a crazy world. Because
yeah.
if you remember when it was like just 14 days to flatten the curve, and it was
Yes.
like, and some libertarians were bringing up objections, and everyone was like, oh, don't, this is just 14 days to flatten the curve. What are you complaining about? And now look at us now. It's just like you given like this is like Bob Higgs's thing or Robert Higgs's like ratchet effect, where it's like the state will take every inch they can get, they'll take every mile they can get, and they will never cede ground ever. Once they have
Yeah.
it, they will never give it back.
And I remember, so when this was happening, there was a period of time where I was kind of on hiatus. Like I wasn't doing my show. It was almost an entire year.
Hmm.
And as COVID was happening, I was not doing it. I was not doing the show. And I remember kind of being alarmed. And I remember at the time, like, I was glad to come home from work because I hated my job. And like, it was a little escape for me. So I didn't really say much of anything. But it very quickly became apparent to me that this was overblown.
Right. Yeah. And it's like the state is going to I think libertarians called it again where it's like look, the state is going to use whatever means necessary, whether they cause it or not. They're going to exploit the situation to the best of their ability for their own ends. So it's yeah.
And I just feel ashamed because I don't remember if it's like was it Walter Reed who was it that published that article on September 12th, 2001?
Oh God. Oh my God. I'm blanking
Women
on the
on
name.
Free Worlds.
Yeah, I know who it is. I'm blanking on the name and I feel terrible.
Me too. Me too.
Oh God.
Um, we're gonna get roasted in the
Yeah,
comments.
we're going to get absolutely roasted. I
Uh,
know. I promise you, I know exactly who it is, and I'm
Me
a
too.
big fan, and I'm just having a brain meltdown right now. So I apologize.
But I wanted to be Johnny on the spot. All of us want to be
Right.
Johnny on the spot because if you're not right at the right time, then it's kind of worthless.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, but to kind of go back to this discussion of risk versus aggression, like
Yeah.
if so theoretically speaking, if we were driving down the road and there was a drunk driver who was going 90 and a 35, do you think that you would have the right to kill that person to stop them from imposing risk?
I think you would have. I would argue that you would probably want to. You would have a right to do things. You would have a right to do things up until the point of killing them. But if killing them was the only way to stop them, then yes. So if you could try to swerve them off the road safely, then you would be within your rights to do that. So I certainly think they're aggressing. I don't think you have a right just to kill someone for speeding though in general. Like unless they're about to hit someone, then you can defensively swerve them out of the way. If that it's a weird theoretical, but if that was possible for you to do, you could do that. Yes.
And I guess the reason why it comes to mind is because at least in criminal law, and I'm not an
Mhm.
expert on criminal law, but the wanton disregard for human life, it
Yeah.
can arise to the point of being criminal, like
Yes.
criminal negligence. And so like if you kill someone being wantonly reckless,
Yeah.
that becomes like the mens rea to justify a homicide charge. Or at least I think it'd be manslaughter or like second degree
I think
homicide.
I think in some places I think it's second degree, and other places manslaughter. But yeah, um, yeah, no, I agree. But I would also because I think people would also use that argument and say, well, look, see, this is a risk. But I think the difference is that when I say threat, I don't even mean it has to be intentional, right? You know what I mean? It just has to be an outward expression that this person is actually actively putting someone else's life at risk, right? So that a risk is just like a statistical probability. Whereas a threat, I would view as an explicit action taken, whether intentional or not, that could harm or put others in danger, essentially. So I think the guy driving 90 and a 35 is actively putting other people in danger. And the risk is obviously going up with that, but we should be careful to separate the two between it's not because the risk necessarily, it's because of the threat from him reckless driving. And I know we're parsing it here and it's getting really, really thin, but I do think that there is still a difference that's important to point out.
And there are quality things that Walter Block brings up, because I think from a libertarian point of view, in any other situation such as this, like say that times are very different and it's 2018 and someone has a high, like a leper or something, like I don't know, can leprosy be spread just by touch?
I think so, but it's kind of overblown. I think the whole like leprosy panic was kind of a thing. Like it definitely can be, but it's like there was a big panic a long time ago how, you know, leprosy was just going to spread everywhere, and that was also overblown.
Biblical.
Right,
well, yeah. Say Typhoid Mary, you know, is coming up to you and coughs on your face.
Right.
Like I guess I don't know if that really is a different scenario than what we've been talking about, but you should have the ability to, within your power. I mean, okay, how about this? What is the proportional response? Because say she coughs on your face, in germ theory aside, you only have what, maybe theoretically a 35% chance of contracting typhoid. Right. And of that 35%, if you do get typhoid, there's like a 15% chance you'll die, let's say theoretically. So what would be the proportionate response? Because theoretically, there is a % chance that she killed you in that moment.
Right. Yeah, no, this is interesting. I think that analogy actually like that lines up much better with Dr. Block's original analogy with the gun, because in that instance she's actively coughing on you, right? So you could analogize that to her pointing the gun, even if it's like a Russian roulette thing where not all the bullets are going to kill you, or not all, you know, the trigger pulls are going to kill you. So in that case, that's a good question. And I think that's definitely more apt as an analogy between those two things, rather than just, you know, walking around and being outside. To that, I would say you probably you certainly have a right to keep her distant at the, you know, for sure. I don't think you would have a right to kill her. You know what I mean? Like that. I think that would go beyond proportionality, and specifically because you don't know, right? Just because you don't know, you can't really prove that. But you would have a right to just keep her distance, certainly, and especially if she was, you know, actively showing symptoms, for sure. Yeah. So you could, like, you know, use as much force as possible as you need to keep her away without, like, just going into the proportionality thing. I think killing her would also violate her rights on the other end. So.
Right. Yeah. And yeah,
there are certainly situations where that might not be the case, right? It's very much contextual on the situation, but yeah.
I'm just picturing a situation where, like, you carry a pole arm and to push people away from you.
Right. Sure.
What do you think about the argument, and I've said this rhetorically, but just basically that if this really was a serious pandemic, you wouldn't have to force people to take all these preventative measures?
Right. Yeah. And this isn't obviously, you know, we don't need to say this, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Obviously, we're not downplaying, you know, the people who have died, but when you compare that to everything else, like all these other things that people die from every year, you can obviously see that this is overblown as compared to everything else. And that's not to say, you know, all those deaths don't matter, but when you look at it in comparison to all the other things that kill people each year, it makes you wonder why this is being singled out so much compared to all those other things. But yeah, I'm so sorry. What was your question? I rambled in.
No. So what I've been saying, and I've heard other people say this, is that if this actually was truly a dangerous disease, you wouldn't have to force people to do anything. They'd quarantine by themselves.
Exactly. And this gets into the whole, you know, whole like just insane argument that people are making now where, you know, we have to keep the vaccinated and the unvaccinated separate. But like, well, for one, the COVID vaccine does not stop the spread. So that doesn't even make sense in the first place why, you know, you're trying to forcibly vaccinate everyone. And two, if the vaccine really worked as effectively as you said, why would it be such a, an issue that unvaccinated people and vaccinated people are commingling? At that point, you would think it would just be an individual risk on the unvaccinated people.
Yeah. And so to get into some of the experts who are speaking out about this, I don't know how deep of a dive you've gone on this.
Not as much as I probably should have, not huge, but I've gotten like I've listened to some pretty good secondhand sources like to deliver the information.
Oh, okay. So like, have you been watching like The Last American Vagabond, like Ryan Christian do anything or?
Not him. No, I haven't seen
Okay.
his work.
Well, I was listening to all this stuff about autoimmune enhancement, like
Mhm.
the kind of the nightmare scenario where basically there's a risk. I understand there's a risk of this with every single vaccine that is administered, period, is that your immune system gets dependent on the presence of the vaccine
Yes.
to fight any disease,
Yeah.
really. But there are really prominent people saying this. Like there is this epidemiologist that I think he's an epidemiologist, but he works with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Gavi. And his name is like Geert. He's Dutch, um, but yeah, he's been saying all this stuff about it, and to see prominent epidemiologists and virologists talk about this,
Hmm.
ringing the warning bells about all this is just pretty kind of scary. It's like I don't.
Right.
It's all I think about, really, which is sad, but I don't want
Yeah.
it to.
It's like the people who are just saying, oh, there's yeah, there's a risk here and there that you could do it, or but you should take the vaccine. In fact, not only should you take the vaccine, they're not even saying that you should be forced to take the vaccine. And if you don't take the vaccine, you should be denied medical treatment. That's also the new one of my new favorite ones I've seen from people. But yeah, you're right, because it's like, okay, if they're going to say that, well, there's just a small risk that you could contract something bad from the vaccine. There's also, if you look statistically, if you're an average person and you're moderately healthy, your chances of dying from COVID are 0.01%, I believe, is the something like that from actually dying. If you're under 70 and moderately healthy, that's your chance of dying. So it's already a very small percent you'll die from COVID. So the idea that they're going to hand wave away the potential dangers of the vaccine because they're minute, it's like, well, why aren't you applying that to COVID?
Right. Yeah. In the I checked the statistics, all this stuff I've been talking about, how they locked Wisconsin school down, particularly
Yeah.
based on close contacts. There are 3 children between the age of 0 and 19 who have died from COVID in Wisconsin since the beginning. And even on the CDC website, it says that those are probable COVID deaths.
Oh, right. So
So
yeah.
in playing into that whole risk factor, this was my other argument against you don't have the freedom to spread COVID, which is, I think, framing the issue wrong.
Yeah, it's
But the argument being is that if you are locking someone down or denying their civil rights because you don't think they have the freedom to spread COVID, as you say it, you are certainly aggressing against them and violating their rights.
that's
Whereas
right.
on the other way around, they just have this small percentage of violating someone else's rights.
Right, exactly. So there's a percentage they might violate your rights, but you're going to violate their rights 100%. But there's a 100% chance that you want to do this because you're advocating for it. So yeah, it's like the difference between like, someone may commit a crime, so I'm just going to commit a crime against them right now. It's
Yeah.
like, no, wait a minute.
I was just watching Minority Report because
Right, yeah.
I heard Pete Quinones had a couple man, their names are escaping me too right now. I don't know if you listened to that one. But who's the guy from Grand Theft World?
I think I did listen to that one. I don't remember the names, unfortunately. I feel bad. I'm terrible with names like that.
We're striking out here, man.
I know.
You know what it is, because we just we think too much. I think.
Too much going on in the noggin.
Yes.
Stumbling around.
Yeah. So, but Minority Report is just very on point with this idea of pre-crime, and
Right.
that's the world we live in right now. It's not framed so much as like, well, yeah, it is. It's murder.
Right.
It has to deal with murder.
And you see this so much in all statist arguments. We can't allow someone to buy a gun because they could go out and murder, so we just need to stop them before they even buy a gun because they're just guilty of murder automatically. And it's like it's really the same foundation that they're working from with COVID. And
Richard Grove is his name.
Richard Grove, yes.
And then the other guy Pete has had on twice. He sounds just like Peter Schiff to me, but he's not. I feel bad for. So, anyways, everyone go listen to Free Man Beyond the Wall in that interview because it was really awesome and conspiratorial in the way that really,
right.
It satiates a thirst that I have.
Right.
So then I wanted to kind of talk about this exchange you had with Clint and lead into something that I have not made my mind up about yet. And so I have to admit I didn't listen to your podcast that you did with Clint. So I'm walking into this kind of blind. I don't know if this issue was resolved between you.
It was an agree to disagree type thing, I think, at the very end. A respectful
And so is it fair to kind of frame this as like post-libertarianism versus libertarianism?
I'm not sure Clint would adopt that necessarily, that label. I don't know. I don't want to put a label on him, but so I'm not going to. Yeah, but yeah.
Well, maybe that's just how I kind of understand it.
Sure. Is
being more of like Pete's argument that we'll be the purest libertarian on the boxcar on the way to the FEMA camp or something like that. Right. And I had this argument, this discussion at the Ron Paul conference that I went to the annual conference in DC a few weeks ago. And I was talking to Tom, and I see names again. Damn it. He's like an old school OG libertarian writer. He was like
Tom Woods. No, I'm just joking.
No. His last name started with an M. He might listen to this too. I feel bad. Damn it. But he was making that kind of argument about free speech on the internet and censorship with social media platforms. But I guess I'm more so of the thing like, so is part of your argument that like you should wear a mask in a private business if they tell you to?
No, not even necessarily. I'm like, if you don't want to wear a mask, they can't force you to wear a mask. They can force you to leave. Right. So I'm not even like capitulating that much to them. I'm just saying that, you have a right to not to wear a mask, but they also have a right to make you leave if you don't. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't you say what your argument is? So I'm just not butchering.
Sure. So I think no, you're fine. No, I think the main disagreement was so I think the disagreement between me and Clint was there was a video a couple weeks ago in New York City of some BLM activists invading a business and attacking a hostess inside the business because they told them they had to wear masks. And Clint, his argument was that he later said, he said he's not justifying it, but he also said that, I'm not going to complain that it's happening either. And my point was that just because the state is, so I just want to come out and be clear. I completely agree that the state is coercing people. The state's coercing the businesses, and by extension, the state is coercing the customers who would naturally be able to enter the business if the state had not employed that obligation on the businesses to deny them service. My only point was that if we assume the business's property is like legitimately owned from the start, and then we go from there, them excluding people itself is not a violation of rights, and therefore people don't have a right to violate the business's rights just for that reason, right? Just for if we only have the hypothetical with those specific parameters, just that involved, then my argument is that you still have to respect the business's property rights, even if they are being coerced. Because now the difference, if I may, the difference some people brought up would be, why do you think that? But when you think a cop is told by the state to go and harass someone, why do you think the cop is guilty and not the business in this situation? My argument would be that the cop is aggressing against people, whereas in this situation it's a little bit different, whereas the business is being coerced to enforce their property rights in a certain way. Which is not aggression in my eye. It's not aggression it's not aggression between the business and the customer. It is aggression between the state and the business and probably the customer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I'm thinking about my own practices because I would advocate that a bunch of people get together and go into a business and let like a flash mob in a way of like a protest. So like in France, they would get a bunch of people who were unvaccinated together, go shop at a shopping mall. That is something I would advocate that people do. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily like again, I think people were trying to frame it as I was like getting real upset over this issue or whatever, but it was like of all the NAP violations, like I'm not even saying that is necessarily one. First off, I just want to say even if it was, I would not be like crazy about it because it's like it's not a serious issue in my eyes, a huge issue, but I do think that if the you should go in there and you should ask them, okay, is this your choice or is the state making you do this, right? Because if it's just the state making you do this and you would naturally want us here, then it's not trespass, right? So I do think it's very important to like question them and make sure to get down to what is their reasoning for this exclusion in the first place. But I think some people were trying to make the argument that they're co-conspiring. And I don't think that's true, at least within the parameters of the hypothetical I proposed before. There are co-conspirators for sure. I certainly think a lot of like the big pharma companies are co-conspirators in state aggression. I definitely agree with that. But one of my mutuals on Twitter, worst_account, he came up with this really good analogy, I thought, which is like if the state mandates seatbelt laws, right? If they mandate that you have to wear a seatbelt, does that mean that if I am in my car, can I not exclude someone from my car because they won't wear a seatbelt? Even if just because the state's enforcing it on me, does that mean that I can't then exclude people from my car for not wearing a seatbelt? So I think that's a pretty good analogy.
Yeah, I think it is a good analogy. And so my mind goes to this place is like, so under criminal law, and again, I said I'm not a criminal law expert here.
Right.
Just remembering from law school that there is a doctrine in the common law where you can claim coercion. Like if someone credibly threatens you or coerces you into committing a criminal act, there is a theory of law that will absolve you of guilt. And that's like if the threat is imminent and if it's credible. So if someone, I think that this is the case. I'm trying to remember the case law, but it says that there was someone who was a victim of the cartel, and the cartel kidnapped his family and forced him to murder someone under the credible threat that they would kill his family, and he was absolved of guilt. It's situations like that. But in our mind, I guess the co-conspirator theory probably doesn't rely on that common law doctrine. Does it in your mind?
Well, it might overlap a little bit, but I don't use that as my like justification for it. You know what I mean? But I respect that that's a thing. I think my main distinction would be that I don't think the businesses in relation to the customers are aggressing against the customers necessarily, right? Because if it's their property and they don't have a right to come in anyway, then them excluding is not really violating the rights of the customers. Now, if the business does genuinely want them there, but they're being forced by the state to say no, then those people coming in against the quote unquote will of the business owner, that would not be trespass in my view, because they actually do want them there. They're just being forced by the state to keep them out. So that form of trespass wouldn't even be trespass in my eyes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and then it gets into this whole like discussion of what is a property right to begin with, because because we think that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of property rights is that it's objective, because it is objective, but at the same time, maybe you can't. Can you then argue that your existence of a property right, I guess, doesn't depend on whether or not you enforce that property right? So if I walk into a store and I'm not wearing a mask and people tell me to wear a mask and I refuse to, but they don't do anything about it, they still have the right to tell me not to wear a mask. But just because they're not enforcing it doesn't mean they, relinquish that right.
Right. And I'm not saying that even if they're not enforcing it, then they really can't claim damages necessarily. You know what I mean? If you're like, if they're not stopping you, then they really can't claim damages, in my opinion. But yeah, I still think they retain that right, even if they're like being coerced by the state to do something, right? Like in the same way, if someone takes over my property, commandeers my property or something, they have control of my property from a descriptive standpoint, right? In the sense that they are controlling it. But from an ethical or moral libertarian standpoint, I would still be the true owner and I would have the moral right to determine how it's used. So if someone took over my property, and that wouldn't necessarily give my neighbor a right to, do whatever he wants to my property because it's now being coerced away from me. Do you know what I mean? Because I would still have retained the moral right. That would be my argument.
Have you heard of adverse possession?
Yes. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious because I deal with that in,
can you give me like a specific example of like in which case?
Yeah. So, okay. Well, say there's two neighbors and they've lived next to each other for the same families have lived next to each other for 40 years. And there is a survey that's done on the property, and neighbor A finds out that neighbor B has a shed that is built on neighbor A's property. And that the shed has been there open notoriously and continuously. These are legal elements for 20 years, which is the statutory period. So technically, by adverse possession, would say that neighbor B's shed, which encroaches onto neighbor A's property, has been homesteaded by neighbor B and belongs to neighbor B.
Yeah. So this is where the gears really get grinding, and when it comes to property rights, right? This is fun. So I would argue, I'm not claiming this is like the libertarian answer. Obviously, I'm just claiming this would be my interpretation. I do think that property can be abandoned even after you've acquired it if it's not used or if someone else has been using it and no one else has stopped them for a long time. I do think that there are cases where they can homestead that property because it's been de facto abandoned. Because if the person just never made a claim for so long, I would decide with the person who's been using the shed on that area for a long amount of time. I know that's like a little more subjective than a lot of people think, but than a lot of people would want. But I think there is some subjectivity to like property rights in practice when you kind of in certain situations there are some gray areas. And I do think that in that situation the property would be abandoned, and then the shed owner or the person who has the shed on the other person's property, but they didn't find out until after, the shed owner would actually still own that shed, in my view.
Yeah, and I mean it gets into like the property. So I really need to brush up on this because I haven't really studied it since I became an ANCAP, which was 4 or 5 years ago now.
Yeah.
But it's exclusion that defines what property is.
Yes. Yeah. All rights in my view, all rights are exclusion rights, like all of them, right? So like the right to your body, the right not to be murdered, you could break it down in some senses that I have a right to exclude threats from my body. I have the right to exclude aggressive actions from my body. And then you can extend that like, and then, it's this idea that you incorporate unowned resources into your projects, into your ongoing uses and projects, and then they become an extension of your being in some sense, right? And so in the same way that I can exclude people from my body, I can exclude people from the things I've acquired with my body.
And that's kind of like, so is this like a Lockean argument that basically you're mixing your labor with it?
I'm kind of critical of Locke because I don't like the metaphor of mixing your labor, because I feel like it's almost too specific and too general simultaneously, and it leads to a lot of confusion. I would just I define I think Hoppe actually kind of fixes this, which is that Hoppe defines just acquisition as first use. Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't come up with all of it, but I think first use is, and that's also a Lockean argument. But I think talking about use and incorporation of things into your ongoing projects, I think that actually encompasses property a lot better than this idea of mixing your labor with the land. I think it's cleaner in my view.
So as part of the mixing your labor argument, does that mean that if you steal something from someone, you're stealing their life from them, basically, because they put time and effort into that thing?
I would not say that, from a metaphorical sense, you could say yes, but from a strict libertarian theory standpoint, I would probably say no. But what they're doing is they're stealing, they're depriving another person of their project, right, or of a piece of their ongoing project. So to me, like theft in a libertarian sense is just deprivation of use from your from your projects. That's how I would define theft. Because, a lot of people use theft colloquially, like, this person stole my joke, or, this thing, I was ripped off, or, all types of stuff like that. But from a purely libertarian standpoint, I think it's deprivation of use of things that you justly acquired.
Yeah. And okay, I agree with you on Hoppe, because I guess I would define my libertarian foundation from a theory of socialism and capitalism. Yeah. So that's probably the greatest. I mean, I would have people read that for sure. If you,
Hoppe and Roderick Long are the two best on like just acquisition of property rights, in my opinion. Those two have done like great work, like fixing some of Locke's mistakes, in my opinion, when it comes to like property. Yeah.
Yeah. That I haven't read Long. I should.
Oh yeah. I can send you this afterwards. He has a whole lecture at Mises Institute where he breaks down like property, and it's the best lecture I've ever seen on property rights ever. Yeah.
Yeah. You should. I should put that in the show notes page for everyone.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, how much time do you have left? Can you go?
I can go for a little bit longer. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the perfect kind of foundation for why you own yourself. I guess I would lead everyone to the Long lecture, but also, Hoppe is so good at that in a theory of socialism and capitalism. And that's my bad. I always do that. So one thing I wanted to kind of bring into this discussion was where we go, what these vaccine mandates can justify, because just quick story is I worked at a really, really big personal injury firm in the state of Wisconsin, and some of the lawyers at that firm, the partners, were some of the greatest personal injury lawyers in the state of Wisconsin in the last 40 years.
Yeah. And
I got into it with one of the senior partners, or maybe it was of counsel. This guy has, I believe that he has successfully tried some like informed consent cases. So medical malpractice, one of the theories is informed consent. And I posted on my personal Facebook, I said basically, if you are someone who is in favor of coercing someone to put something in their body against their consent, you should take a long look in the mirror and consider that you're on the wrong side of history.
Yes.
kind of like are we the baddies?
Right. Yeah.
That meme. And so he comments and he says, no, on the contrary, I'm sorry, but it's people with a misunderstood understanding of liberty who will not be remembered well by history.
Oh.
And then so I was like, okay, is this coming from the same person that, like, what about informed consent? Canterbury versus Spence was one of the first major cases in the United States to deal with informed consent. And it recognized under the common law system that, we own ourselves, that basically you can't make a decision about a medical procedure unless you've been informed of all the risks. Right. And it's actually a common law battery for a physician to, so for a physician to do that against your will or not provide informed consent.
Right, because if it's almost like, it's much worse, but like fraud, right? If you sell someone something and you don't tell them all the defects of it when you sold it to them, you've essentially defrauded them because they're not buying the thing they thought they were buying, the thing thought they were transacting the money for, but in a much worse case, right, with their body. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like especially, things like the vaccine. It's like there are things in this that it's has not been through a lot of test runs, a lot of trial runs. So there are unforeseen things that very much could cause complications for these people later on in life, and we won't know. So I definitely think that there is certainly a case. And as I was saying before, I do think like a lot of these big pharma vaccination, like Pfizer and stuff like this, I would view these companies as aggressors because they're co-conspirators with the state, because they genuinely do have advocated for vaccine mandates and lockdowns and all of this. So those people are absolutely co-conspirators in my eyes.
Now, what makes them exactly? Is it the advocating for it and the guiding the policy that makes them co-conspirators?
More so guiding it, yeah. It's not just their opinion, right? They're actively they have the ear of the state and they're actively asserting that the state should do this, right? So it's not just a mere opinion someone has. That would be the difference between like, well, your neighbor has an opinion, well, they should go and mandate this vaccine, versus the people who actually have sway with the state, who can attempt to use them for their own purposes. That's how I would parse the difference between like someone just having an opinion and someone actively becoming a co-conspirator through advocacy of aggression.
And what he did basically is he did this magic wand wave where he said, this is totally unapplicable in this situation. And I just but what he said basically was, basically you're putting everyone else at risk. You don't have the freedom to spread a disease, which to be fair, we already went over this already, but there is a rings of truth, because you can't infect someone with HIV on purpose.
Right. But this goes back to it's kind of like a dishonest argument in my opinion, because when you're talking about like gun rights or something, and someone will say, well, you don't have the right to shoot another person. It's like, yes, I agree with that, but that's not what we're arguing, right? You know what I mean? It's like, I'm not arguing that someone has a right to buy a gun and shoot you. I'm saying they have a right to buy a gun. So yeah, they like to combine these things together and then kind of straw man.
Yeah. And but where it goes from here basically is because a lot of people will cite Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which I don't know if you're familiar with this.
I'm not.
So this was, I think, a state law. Yeah, it was a state law case where the state of Massachusetts, I think a locality or something like that, had an ordinance that required everyone in a small town to be vaccinated against smallpox. And Jacobson, basically the law was upheld by the Supreme Court. This is like a 1905 case. And I think what it was saying is that the federal government doesn't have the right to tell the states or localities. It doesn't have a right to strike down their mandatory vaccinations. But Massachusetts had an out, saying like, okay, you could either be vaccinated or pay a nominal fine one time, right? And so he sued against that. But my essential argument is that Jacobson versus Massachusetts was the main case that was cited in Buck v. Bell, which is the case where I think it was the state of Virginia or something, wanted to sterilize inmates in a mental institution. And
wow.
Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the main opinion, and basically he's famous for saying 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, is more than enough. Like, let's tie your tubes and be done with it. And this, if you think about it, mandatory sterilization is very analogous to vaccination, because nominally speaking, let's say the vaccine, doesn't have many known side effects or anything like that. It's mostly fine. If you don't want the vaccine, and they give you the vaccine, if it's safe, you're not going to die. Like you just don't want it. You're not consenting to it. Whereas if you sterilize Carrie Buck, she's not going to die. She just can't have kids anymore. So do you find this analogous? Because Oliver Wendell Holmes did.
Well, yeah, it's so crazy, right? Because I mean, yeah, I can see the analogy there, and it's I think this is the whole point, or the problem, in my opinion, with legal precedent, because it's like, oh look, we violated people's rights here a long time ago, and now we're going to use this as a justification to do it again. So whenever someone says, well, there's a precedent for it, it's like, well, that's not a justification alone. It's like if some murderer goes and goes to the judge, he's like, but sir, I've murdered people before. It's like, it's not going to be like, oh, I guess it's okay then if there's a precedent for it. It's like, no.
Yeah, and that gets into whole the whole constitutional jurisprudence thing. It's like, I don't know if you know Dean from Dino Files.
Oh, he's a good friend of mine. I love Dino Files.
Okay, yeah. So Dean, he's a law student now, and we had a great episode. But we were just talking about it. And he's like, yeah, it's all make 'em ups. That's all. Right. It's like, well, what they're doing is the Constitution is a piece of positive law. It's a creation of the legislature, and what they do is they try to interpret common law based off of a piece of positive law. It's all make 'em ups in my opinion.
It's like trying to force the square block into the triangle hole. It's like, it's just
no, yeah. So yeah, in that precedent, it's just, I mean, I don't know if it's a slam dunk for me to say that, well, look, that Jacobson case directly led to like your logic directly led to sterilizing imbeciles or those mentally unfit individuals. I don't know how good of an argument that is logically speaking, but it certainly wins points.
Right. And I mean, it's certainly true, like in the sense that, yeah, you're forcing something into someone's bodies. And even if your intent was, even if there's some adverse reaction that was not the intention of the vaccine, if it hurts them, it's still essentially the same outcome, where it's like
Right.
you have damaged this person, even if you didn't intend to. And that's your responsibility, at that point. So, like, if all these people with these adverse reactions to the vaccine, like, even if we, accept, which I don't, obviously, forcefully vaccinate them, what about all these people who do have adverse reactions to it?
Right.
Are they're going to say, oh, we're not liable, sorry? It's like, no, you are actually,
Yeah.
in my view. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it just for people who haven't looked into the VAERS numbers, I think it's quite alarming because it is a truthful statement to say that the number of probable deaths from the vaccines, at least according to VAERS, number in like the 16,000 range, and I'm sure
Yeah.
that's growing.
And that's a large amount for a vaccine.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I think it was true to say that in the last 10 years, the number of people who have died from vaccines, all vaccines, has been under 200.
Yeah.
So those are factual statements, YouTube.
Right. Yeah. Those are just the numbers.
And there was an actual study. I don't know if it was like the Lancet or Duke or something like that, who the study concluded that VAERS actually only represents 10% of the actual reporting of the cases.
Oh, wow.
Or Johns Hopkins study. I'd love to be able to cite that right offhand right now, but so the real number could be like 150,000 or something like that.
Wow.
But this is definitely going to get deleted.
This is good. Yeah, you do.
I just did it to myself. But.
I'm sorry. That's
no, I mean, my whole thing about that is like, fuck them.
right. Yeah,
it's gonna happen. I'm not gonna change my message, but
right. Yeah, that's good.
So for you, man, is there anything else that we haven't touched on, like on this topic, that you really wanted to make sure you said?
I do want to kind of go back just for a second. I do kind of go back to Walter Block's analogy about like the gun, because I do think it's really important to hit this home. Because so like earlier, like when I was talking about like risk versus threat, when you are actually threatened, your risk goes up. Do you know what I mean? Like if someone just has a gun and they're holstered it, and you walk into a room and he's the only person with the gun, your risk has obviously gone up. You know what I mean? But if he pulled out the gun and pointed it at someone, that would be a threat that was also accompanied by an increase of risk. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
so
yeah.
Like the risk has obviously gone up, but it's very important to say that it's not because the risk has gone up that we're allowed to act against him. We're allowed to act against the gunman because he actually initiated a threat by pointing the gun. So it's very important to like parse those two different things between risk and threat. So just because a risk goes up and you see libertarians saying, okay, now we can act against him, it's not like it's a correlation causation breakdown, right? Where it's like just because the risk is correlated with the threat, it's not the same thing as or didn't cause the threat, or it's not the same thing as the threat. So I think that's very important to distinguish in these types of examples.
Is that the difference between mens rea and risk? Like
kind of. Yeah, I would say so. Like, and I don't even mean that. Like, by threat and risk, you can threaten someone without intending to threaten them. Even, you know what I mean? But it does have to be an actual. It has to be something you can. There has to be some causal chain that will lead to your. That will actively lead to your harm, essentially. And it can't just, because risk is just, when you think about risk, it's just a probability. It's just a statistical probability. And from a libertarian standpoint, I don't think you can make value judgments on, or you're not authorized to act against someone from statistical probabilities, in my view.
This kind of leads into, I did an episode too with David, and he's another law student buddy of mine. I was talking to him the other day, and we went over, I think, like Rothbard's proportion and
Punishment.
punishment and proportionality. Sorry.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the analogy he makes about, I think it's like a store owner who is righteously evicting or like fighting off bandits.
Yeah.
And the sheriff comes and mistakenly shoots the store owner because,
Yes.
yeah. Does that apply at all?
So in Rothbard's analogy, I'm pretty sure he says that just because even if the sheriff got it wrong, he would still be he would still be guilty of what he did because he got it wrong.
Yeah.
Are you asking if that applies to what case, like what scenario?
Yeah, I'm just trying to make connections here because, we're talking about a guy who walks into the store and he has a gun holstered, but when he pulls it out and points it at someone, I guess I don't know what the connection would be here. If there is a connection, because we only have so much Rothbard available, and if we try to glean everything that we can out of the example we have.
I'm not sure that specifically applies here perfectly or doesn't overlap perfectly, but I certainly think Rothbard brings up a really good point about, like, even if you're wrong in a case, like if you go to stop an aggression and it turns out it wasn't an aggression and you're wrong, you're still liable, right? So I definitely agree with that part of that part. I'm not sure if it perfectly overlaps, but it certainly says that. I certainly think it makes a good case that you can't just if you act upon risk, like you say, okay, this person is a risk to me and I'm going to act against them. If it turns out they were not actually a threat, you're liable for aggressing against them. If it turns out that they were just a risk and not a threat, or they're not, no, I'm sorry, not that they were a risk, but there was a risk around them, around their presence. So I think you can definitely glean something from that, where it's like, yeah, if you're wrong, like all these people who are like, well, this person may have COVID, so I'm going to forcefully lock them down in their house. If you do that and it turns out they weren't actually a threat to you and you can't prove that they were a threat to you, you just imprisoned someone.
Right.
I would have argued you're guilty of imprisoning them, and yeah, you aggressed against them.
Yeah. And I think that's the connection I was trying to make is trying to act in the world, especially when Walter Block was writing this, and I think he makes a very valid point, is that at this point in time, we're dealing with limited information here.
Yeah.
And a lot of these decisions have to be made. I guess the exact prime examples that we're making, time is a lot more limited than what it was when Walter Block wrote this article at the beginning of the pandemic, because our examples are dealing with like up close and personal interactions, but and I think a lot of libertarians were kind of grappling with this. Everyone was limited knowledge in the face of an emergency or a perceived emergency, trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I think it's very important that like libertarians though stay away from like pre-crime, like trying to say, well, this group may statistically like they may murder more people. This group may steal from more people, so therefore we need to enact policies against these people to stop them from stealing or murdering. It's like no. At that point, you're just going into like the collectivist trap, right? Trying to do this whole thing where it's like, I'm very weary of anyone who takes a statistic and then tries to make a libertarian case for or against something from just a statistic. I think that's very dangerous. And you see that especially with like COVID too and stuff like that, right? It's like you're taking a statistic and then you're just drawing from the statistic. Now I get to, forcibly lock you in your home. And without any sense of like jurisprudence, in the sense that you have a burden of proof to prove that they are aggressing against you, and you're just going to ignore that and say, well, look at the statistic. Statistically, this person might have COVID and he might infect me, so therefore I get to do whatever I want to him. I think that's very dangerous for any argument people make, but especially COVID right now.
Yeah, and I really hope that this turns out all right. Like there have been reasons for optimism, I think, and I think people like I hope people across the world are waking up right now.
Oh yeah.
But I worry that it might be too late, and I just worry that the state is just so omnipresent and just this lurching, unstoppable force that it's futile.
there's cases, as you said, there's cases for optimism and there's cases for pessimism. So on one hand, on the pessimistic side, we're still taking our shoes off at airports. We still have to go through the TSA years after 9/11, 20 years after 9/11. And on the optimistic case, we could say that maybe at one point the state will push too hard, too fast, and it will cause this breaking point for people. And that's horrible in a lot of sense. I'm not wishing, I don't like wish that in a sense, but I think it would be like a silver lining type thing where it's like we can pull some good from the bad.
And I hope that's happening right now. There's some signs that that's what's happened right now, is that people are like, wait a second, like even police. So the police officers in my town got this order from the health department, and basically the sheriff's department and the police, the city police said, they made public statements saying, we're not enforcing this policy.
Oh, that's good.
It's like, if the school wants to punish kids, they can punish kids, but we're not going to arrest kids for going to school.
Right. Yeah.
So it's even the thin blue line community around here has some sense of like, hey, that's not all right.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good, especially with people who say, this is like, I don't know if you saw that poll recently, and I'm not sure like the veracity of it or anything, but it's like 50% of Trump supporters now support secession, and I think a large amount of Biden voters also support, like 40% or something, like 42% or something. It's like, at a certain point, this is going to become so conflicted that people might just say, okay, we're done, and let's go our separate ways here. And I think that would be for the best. I don't know how like plausible that is in a realistic sense, but I certainly think that I'm not happy about like the growing animosity in a vacuum, but I think it could lead to good things, possibly.
I sure hope so, and I sure hope that my state goes the right way. But I don't think it will.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's when you keep pushing for like town secession from the state, and you just hopefully you can get enough support, for that.
Hey, around here it might work. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, anything you want to plug?
You can just find me on Twitter at ace_argus, and I co-host the Slurp Gang podcast, which is nothing like this. There's no libertarian theory on it, and you should bring heavy alcohol and drugs before you listen. All right. But that's it. Thanks so much for having me on, Patrick. This was great.
Yeah, of course. Right on. And where can people find Slurp Gang too?
You can find it on pretty much any podcatcher. That's available pretty much. Yep.
I will say, who came up with the name? Because I think the name is brilliant.
Okay, so this was I have to shout out two people here. There are two of my friends, Mel, Small Crimes on Twitter, and then my other friend Duncan. They both came up with the name, and they essentially allowed when I came to them with the idea that, hey, I want to make a podcast, can I use that name? They were like, oh yeah. Mel was all like, oh yeah, go ahead. So that's kind of like the background on it, and so yeah, it's just like people were just, we were joking around one day in chat, and then someone mentioned the name, and we thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, I don't know, it has a ring to it, and I'm sure there's meaning behind the name, I guess. But
well, maybe we'll see. We don't know.
Okay, and then I wanted to give a shout out to Neophyte Gear too, because I listened to your episode with him.
Yeah, Greg.
And I'm sorry, Greg is his name.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I love the whole concept of what he's doing with that store.
Yeah, I also, now thank you for bringing that, because I do want to plug that site. Go to neophytegear.com, and he has a bunch of great things. I bought his hot sauce today, actually. Yeah. And his 4-pack, great hot sauce. So even if you're not into like, even if you don't like have the money to spend on like gear or equipment or like lowers or anything like that, you should go out and buy his hot sauce, because it's really great, and it's a good way to support, I guess a local business, if you can call it that, on like where we come from on Twitter. So yeah, definitely.
For sure. Yeah, well, I'm glad we did this, Ace. I've been meaning to get you on for a long time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Patrick.
All right. Peace.
Later.